We're here, we made it. It's the end of 2018. I originally had a glass of water over there. I should have grabbed it. Oh well. This is some great albums that came out in 2018. And for the past few years I've been doing these where I'm like, okay, these are the 5 great things that came out of this year. I think that started back in 2013 when I did the Games of the Year list. And that's expanded now to be Games of the Year and Albums of the Year. But I'm also doing a 3rd one this year, which I hope will become tradition. So I have 5 albums that I want to mention as being really good. I have one that I want to call Album of the Year, and I have some honorable mentions beforehand. So it's actually going to be a total of 10 for this video. Some of the other ones, the 3rd one actually is 10. The Game of the Year isn't going to be 10, but the first one I give a shout out to, this isn't like the 10th best album of the year. This is like why I call it honorable mentions and shout outs, because Toilet by Clowncore, and like stick with me here. So Clowncore is this Facebook meme that went like crazy like months and months ago, right? Hell, I think was the first music video that came out. Is these 2 dudes in like a porta potty with keyboards and just drums and the whole thing, and it's just so ridiculous. And it's also like the music is just like not but it's like it's catchy enough that you keep listening. It's visually bizarre enough for you to keep watching, and it just kind of spread like wildfire. It's like, what are these 2 dudes doing? The thing is that what a lot of people don't know after that video spread around is that there's just more videos after that. What is this leading to? Like, what are all these videos leading to? Because Clowncore existed years ago, and they did like a few like live shows that they posted their YouTube channel and things like that. But like, what is all this leading to? And the answer was it led to an album release on iTunes. It's exactly that video that you've seen on Facebook, but expanded into an album, and it's surprisingly cohesive despite being as ridiculous as it is. Next I want to talk about Kids See Ghosts. This was an album that on my 2nd channel, but I basically just completely trashed the album. I was like, this album's garbage. Kid Cudi's barely in tune. The production's just weird. A lot of the songs go on for way too long. Like, there are some songs that were really short, but then you have Reborn, which goes on for like 5 minutes of just Kid Cudi moaning. But then I kept listening to it, and I kept listening to it, and part of it was because I wanted to listen to the whole Kanye West Good Music Fridays marathon right after the Tiana album came out. I just wanted to listen to the whole thing front to back. So I started with Pusha T, then I did Ye, then I did Kids See Ghosts, then I did Nasir, and then I did Keep That Same Energy, right? And I went through the whole marathon, and then Kids See Ghosts kept coming out as this sort of weird highlight where it's like, yeah, it's weird, yeah, Cudi's, you know, he's more in tune admittedly than he has been, but he's still not in tune most of the time. But like, it clicks, something clicks, and it works. Like, it's flawed, but it works. I wouldn't say it's like the best album of the year, and some people are gonna say that. Definitely not perfect, but it grew on me, and I do revisit it, and I do enjoy it, so there you go, you win. Next one I want to talk about is Boarding House Reach by Jack White. When this album dropped, you know, a lot of people were saying it was really good, and I'm like, but Jack White, you know, I mean, the White Stripes were great, but when they broke up, when Jack White started doing his own thing, the quality just kind of dropped severely. There was something about that particular pairing that made Jack White's songwriting stand out, and the Meg White drumming was like really, it complemented it very well. And I think when that whole thing dissipated, I think that when Jack White went to his solo stuff, it just didn't click as well. But then with this album, he just took this very like avant-garde, not necessarily like crazy avant-garde, but I think he pulled inspiration from all sorts of different genres. And I think he kind of fused it together into this sound that just really worked, and it really clicked, and I really liked it. And there was a lot of moments on this record that, you know, I wouldn't say are good by rock music standards, but they're good by all sorts of other standards. Some of my biggest highlights on the album are some of the weirdest, you know, craziest things that Jack White has ever done in his extensive career, and I think that really stands out. So there's that. The next one I want to talk about is Iridescence by Brockhampton. I think it's their best album. And it really took a bit for it to grow on me as much as it did. I originally said that Saturation 3 was better. Saturation 2 might even have been better. But this album really grew on me, and I think its diversity and, you know, how much it highlights a lot of the other members of Brockhampton. I think the Saturation trilogy kind of got stolen sort of by Amir and Kevin, where here, I mean, 1, Amir's gone for a number of reasons, but 2, I think Kevin kind of took the backseat on this one too, you know, and some people kind of were like, oh, Kevin, but you're great. And he is great, but I think it was neat that like we have a lot of other members highlighted. A lot of the more laid back and more emotionally driven tunes, I think are some of the biggest highlights in Brockhampton's entire career, even if they may have gotten more famous off of the more exciting and eccentric and, you know, hype songs, for lack of a better term. And they certainly have some of those on here, like New Orleans and things like that, but I think some of the biggest highlights on here are songs like Wait or Tanya, some of the more emotional tracks on there that I really, really liked. The last shout out, honorable mention, whatever, that I want to give is Firepower by Judas Priest, which is easily Judas Priest's best album in, you know, at least a decade. And it's been a long time since we have a Judas Priest album this good. And I think it goes to show that this sort of conventional, you know, straightforward, you know, to the point heavy metal still has a place in music in 2018 if it's done well. In the early 2000s, there was the new metal thing and things like that. But I think now a lot of times heavy metal acts sometimes pull inspiration from all sorts of different things. So they feel like they need to do this in order to be relevant. Well, really what you need to do is just be good. And the Judas Priest was really good. And that's why people like it. So more of that. Consistent, good, heavy, energetic, great riffs, great singing. Like, these dudes are old now. How is the singing this good? How are the vocals this good? It's crazy. So, yeah. All right, now it's time to get into the real list. Number 5 is Daughters, You Won't Get What You Want. This album just, I mean, it knocked me down, beat me up, you know, bleeding everywhere, black eye, I don't freaking know. This thing was a nightmare in the best way possible. It painted that picture perfectly. It did exactly what it set out to do so well. I never listened to Daughters before people were saying, you know, this album is fantastic, like holy crap, Daughters is back, you know, that whole thing. You could take the entire rest of their prior discography and it would be shorter than this album. I'm like pretty sure. So the fact they put this much time and effort into you know, a project this long, 49 minutes. You know, I was sort of talking about this when I did the quick thoughts on it, but I think like there's sort of these like sort of all sorts of different aspects to the title that sort of play throughout the record. There's some underlying sexual themes, there's some underlying, you know, musical motifs that lead into you not getting what you want, that you expect something and then something different happens instead, sort of depriving you of that desire you have as a listener to listen to something and then it being, you know, it being twisted on you, right? And those things just keep happening and happening and building and building and building and building until you get to the last track, which is just like one of the best album closers I've listened to in a long time. It's not something I would deliberately choose to listen to all of the time to be in the right mood for it, but it's definitely one of the most horrifying albums I've listened to in a long time. I would say like the last album that scared me this much legitimately was like Carrick Angren's Lamendum, like their first album. So that's number 5. Number 4 is The Book of Ryan by Royce da 5'9".
Don't you grade me next to these rappers, baby, that's degrading. My style got so many different facets, I switch into so many different patches. I'm skipping class to be fascinating. My pen is like Big Ben, this shit just a classic way.
I listened to Layers, I thought it was really good. It wasn't like, you know, crazy album of the year stats or everything, but I was impressed by how personal Royce was compared to a lot of his older stuff. And then he drops The Book of Ryan, which is even more personal, more historical, more going into all these different aspects of his personal life that make him who he is. And then when you learn like what the title means through that skit, his son making this project, it's like, I want to talk about my dad and how he influences me because he's such a huge impact on my life. But then that plays into how Royce's own dad and upbringing played and affected his life. So it's sort of this, you know, two-way street of like, you know, Royce is who he is because of his dad's mistakes, and then Royce's own mistakes and attempted parenting is informing his own child, right? And it's sort of this cycle of, you know, how your upbringing affects who you are, and then the things that you do affecting your child's upbringing, and then so on and so on and so forth, right? And that results in some of the most, you know, crazy, like personal and in-depth storytelling narrative tracks that I've heard in a long time. Protecting Ryan is a real highlight for that one, because like at first you're just like, what is going on? Like, what is the, like what's going on? But then you notice that there's like actual flow and rhyming and into this, but it's a story. He's just telling a story of this time that his brother like saved his life through protecting him, but then sacrificed himself in order to do that. And then there's the conversation afterwards of like, well, Royce now has all this fame and all this sort of stuff, and but his he wouldn't have done that had his brother not protected him in that moment. And he's like, at the end of the song, thank you. That's crazy good. It's insane. I love this. I love that track so much. And that wasn't even like the best track from a musical standpoint. That was just a really good story. I'm going down to this album now because I just want to look at more of these tracks. Oh, Cocaine, that's another one. Cocaine was this, that was very much into Royce's dad informing him, where it's like, you know, his dad did cocaine and eventually had to quit because it was like he wanted to be a good parent to his kid. So it's like, the whole last verse is like, you chose me over cocaine and I'll love you for that forever. So it's coming from this tone of like, you know, a lot of people say, oh, my parents were this, my parents were that, and they did all these mistakes. But Royce is coming from it, is like, hey, you quit for me. You did this for me. There's a point in time where I said that this album was very bloated. I thought that there was a lot of tracks that didn't really like need to be there. But the more you listen to it, and especially if you read along to the album, every track needs to be there. Every track is telling a story, every track has its purpose, and it's a very, very solid, if a bit lengthy, but necessarily lengthy listen. The next one is Peace by Graveyard.
First time I came to the city, I knew just what I do. I got peace on wheels and a grip I could feel. Some wine and some tape for my reel to reel, yeah.
This is a very personal choice for me. I don't think a lot of people are going to put this album as their album of the year. It's a very conventional blues rock album. But I think what Graveyard's strength is they've managed to pull a lot of blues influence into a heavier sound. If you go back as early as their first album, I mean, you could confuse them for a heavy metal act, and a lot of times even iTunes categorizes them as heavy metal sometimes, right? But the more you go through their discography, the more their blues influences show more and more and more and more. And now we've gotten to the point where Peace is this perfect marriage of heaviness, density, blues, riffs, you know, straightforward lyrics that are just insanely catchy, singable, and you can pick up on it very quickly. It pulls back to those blues roots, you know, all of those classic tracks. It feels like Graveyard's making those classic tracks again, anew. And it's a shame that they're as small as they are, and unfortunately, at least in the West, you know, music from Sweden doesn't really carry very far, which is very sad. I think a lot of their tracks, really, if they were, you know, done by, you know, more well-known pop artists, if they were covered by them, I feel like those songs would pick up instantly. It's sort of like the Ariana Grande cover of that Thundercat song that went out this year. Like, a lot of people discovered Thundercat through that cover. Just incredibly catchy album all the way through. The only thing I have with it, the only problem I have with it is some of the tracks just stop too short. I want them to keep going. But I think that also kind of plays into it. It's like, if you're listening to, like, I'm going to give a very basic example. If you're listening to the Folsom Prison Blues, you could keep singing that song forever and ever and ever and ever, because it's such a simple and basic blues riff that just keeps going, and then it transitions to the thing, and then it just, you know, it just, you could keep making verses for it and sing the Folsom Prison Blues forever. But the point is that it eventually has to end, right? I really, really like Graveyard, and Peace is their best album. Okay, so I mentioned Kids See Ghosts earlier in the honorable mentions, but there is one album from the Good Music Fridays that, you know, really stands out as being the highlight of the year, and that's Daytona by Pusha T.
Where were you when Big Meech brought the Tigers in? Cause I was busy earning stripes like a tiger skin. Bricklayers and ball shorts, coaching from the side of the ball court. If you know, you know. One stop like a Walmart. We got the tennis balls for the wrong sport. If you know, you know.
That first album dropped, and it was just set the bar so high, and every other album that came after that was a disappointment. And it's just because it was so perfectly crafted. You could feel that energy between them. You could feel it, like Kanye gave him the basic beat, and then he raps over it, and then Kanye adds something to it, and then comes back to Push, and Push is like, oh, let me add this, and it just keeps going and going and going, and it came to these really tightly done, perfect tracks. It's just everything. It's just so meticulously put together, and it just, it's crazy how well this album flows together. It's crazy how the subject matter just keeps going and going and going. The track listing, the sequencing of this is perfect. Like, everything is just so well thought out. for, you know, for an album on the label that Kanye West runs. If you know is the whole intro to the album. It's sort of saying like, hey, if you know what I'm talking about, if you lived this life, then you're gonna know the upcoming lyrics better than other people. Because I was there and you were there. I certainly wasn't there, so I mean, but that's the primer for everything else. And then the next one is the games we play with this crazy, it's just like coke rap at its finest. It's just the great beat. It's like I don't know what it is with Pusha T, but the second track on all of the solo albums have like the best beat ever. So, I mean, the same case here. Hard Piano, this is such a good track. And then freaking Comeback Baby, it's like this really old school R&B riff placed over the heaviest beat of all time. How does that flow as well as it does? It shouldn't work, but it does. And then Santeria, and then freaking, like, I mean, people didn't know what Kanye could do because he was saying all these crazy things, and then it comes back to what would Meek do with the trolliest, most ridiculous verse of all time, and that was after Pusha T delivered one of his best verses on the album. And then Infrared comes in and he's just like, so that was my album, guys, and like, I'm just better than all of you, and I wrote all these songs, unlike you, Drake, you know. It's a flawless album. Only critique is the transition from the games we play to Hard Piano doesn't flow as well as it could. That's the only critique I have. And finally, my album of the year, the one that I think people that saw my Twitter account when it came out, I think they know what the album of the year is. I have it here with me. It's Year of the Snitch by Death Grips. Freaking the craziest album cover, and I love how on this, when you slide it, the teeth slide out. It's like, that's just ridiculous, my guy. I discovered Death Grips literally like 2 years ago. Like I didn't grow up with Death Grips, if that makes sense. Like, I mean, they started in like 2011, so I wouldn't say I would have grown up with them anyway, but it's not like I saw this unfold. I discovered them with Bottomless Pit, and then I went back and listened to their older discography, and I was like, okay, this is a pretty solid, you know, pretty solid group. I think that a lot of the things that they do are very, you know, not accessible is the best way to put it. But surprisingly enough, I would argue that this is their most accessible album, despite being as weird as it is. Look at this back cover. Look at this. What is that? It's disgusting. I love it. And the reason why I say I think it's their most accessible album is like things like Bottomless Pit or freaking Jenny Death or things like that. And then if you go to like the really weird ones, you know, those are a bit too weird, right? But I think this strikes this proper balance of being like using pop music sensibilities in a way that like makes the music inherently catchy. It pulls you in, right? Where I think a lot of other Death Grips music, I think it pulls you in for different reasons. I think a lot of people like Death Grips music just because of its aggressiveness, or because of its subject matter, because of its lyrics, or because of how much they troll people on social media and in real life. I mean, I've listened to this thing enough times where it's like, I'm not, the whole like shock value aspect has sort of almost gone away. And then you, below that is like really like solid chord progressions that are very, you know, rudimentary, if that makes sense. They're not crazy. They're not going nuts, you know what I mean? And I think because of that, I think the song, every song just is super, super catchy. Even the craziest songs, like Linda's in Custody, even those are rooted in very basic chord progressions. And I think because of that, even those songs end up being more accessible than some of the weirder songs in some of their other albums. The album just flows super well too. I mean, it jumps from these like really aggressive tracks to like the more relaxed, like kind of laid back tracks very well. Death Grips made this album with the expectation that fans would be disappointed, hence the last track, right? It's too different from this, you know, hyper aggressive, angry, I hate everything, you know, sort of sound that Death Grips was sort of, that culture that Death Grips was sort of cultivating, right? This album was not that. It was much more depressing. It was much more meticulous. It was much more, it was lower key. Their attempt at sort of, you know, throwing their fans under the bus and doing something different ends up being the venue where a lot more people can come in and listen to them and respect their music. Even if they don't like it, even if they're like, nah, not for me, but I get it. Where I think a lot of times with other albums, it's like, I don't get this. I don't get why people like this. This is just weird noise, right? Certainly the case with Bottomless Pit. If you don't know like noise music or, you know, death metal, things like that, you wouldn't understand the influences behind Bottomless Pit. If you didn't listen to a lot of underground rap, then you wouldn't understand the Money Store, right? And if you didn't understand Lord, then you wouldn't understand And on the Moon. It's sort of the culmination of everything Death Grips has been doing too, because the crazy thing, Death Grips samples themselves on here. Like, I mean, some of their older albums, they would like record random things just in their experience wherever, and then integrate that into their music. But here they're sampling like their older music, which is like a whole other level. It's just crazy. Like, I don't know. Like, I could go each track by track. I could be like, oh, you know, Death Grips is online. It's this really nice, it's this really cool, like, almost like pseudo-punk thing that comes into this sort of almost electronic, like, repetitiveness that you get from, like, electronic music. That's why I said electronic repetitiveness, in addition to the fact that there is literal electronic distortion on some of it. And then it goes into Flies, which is definitely one of the weirder songs, too. But, like, it also goes from that simplicity. It's building off of the Should the Opportunity Arise, Vomit Me, Flies. It just it builds off of that, and then it goes into the hyper aggressive like hit, but it doesn't do it with it just does it with the vocals. It doesn't do it with the production. So that kind of throws you off, but then it cycles back and you're like, oh, I get it, and I get this progression, and it works, and it clicks, and it's catchy, and I love it. And I could just keep going, but I'm not going to. You're the Snitch, album of the year. Go listen to it. If you're not a Death Grips fan, I don't care. Listen to it. Listen to like a song like Streaky. Like, people, like, Death Grips fans hate that song, but like, you'll probably like it if you're not a Death Grips fan. I like it. I think it's really good, but I would say it's one of the weaker songs of the album. But I think that's a good entry point. So listen to that song and like tell me that you don't understand why people like it. And that's the test. And then, if you want to go back, if you're like, okay, I kind of get this, then go back and listen to the rest of the album. And then you're going to get to the point where that Streaky, that song that got you in the first place, is going to be like your least favorite song on the album, as it is for me. So, like, there's that. So, I mean, I can't recommend this album highly enough. So, album of the year. It's right here. I love it. Go listen to it. Next video is going to be a game of the year. I don't know when it's going to come out, but it'll come out soon because we got to get all these videos out by the end of the year, right?